What was meant to be a safari turned into a 5.5 hour trip to nowhere where they felt kidnapped. I'm Adrian, the cruise and travel guy, and today's video is very much a cautionary tale, something you need to be aware of when you cruise. As many of you know, part of the fun of any cruise is getting off a ship and exploring new places. Typically, many people do choose a cruise line shore excursion, but the price of these has been going up and up. And if you're a family of 2, 3, 4, 5 people, that can really add up. As an alternative, people will often do their own thing, whether that is completely private by themselves like I did in Japan, or they might organize a private shore excursion through a company that is not affiliated with the cruise line. Generally speaking, there's a lot of money to be saved by doing this, and you can sometimes get a more local experience, one where you're not entirely herded around in a big group like you can sometimes be on a cruise line shore excursion. So this story is really about Nancy and Mike, who run the YouTube channel Living Phase 2. It's an awesome channel and I recommend that you check it out and subscribe. They're currently on board Royal Caribbean's 9-month world cruise. It's the world cruise that was made famous by TikTok and TikTok influencers. And it started in December last year when it departed from Miami in Florida. But one of the things that happened during the cruise was the conflict in the Red Sea began, which meant that the cruise line had to alter the ship's itinerary. On board the ship, passengers were given the option to vote for their preferred itinerary change, and I believe they had 3 options. The winning option was an immersive Africa itinerary. That meant that Serenade of the Seas would sail up the west coast of Africa en route to the Mediterranean. With the change of plans, cruisers had to adapt, and obviously the cruise line had to then prepare shore excursions for a lot of these cities and places that there was no intention of visiting when the cruise was originally planned. In one of their latest videos, Nancy and Mike documented their experience in Luanda, Angola. Their tale is definitely a cautionary one and full of intrigue and almost mystery. Their video details their experience on a private shore excursion that they did book by themselves. And I gotta tell you, it's pretty harrowing. What was meant to be a safari turned into a 5.5 hour trip to nowhere where they felt kidnapped. Things started off rocky pretty much straight away. Nancy and Mike talk about the fact that when they got off the ship, they jumped onto one of the port shuttles that took them to the port entrance outside of the actual port itself. Once there, they were meant to meet their private shore excursion, and no one was there for them. There were some other guides there for other arranged tours, but not theirs. While waiting for their guide to arrive, they witnessed Royal Caribbean shore excursions departing the port gates with police escorts. That's probably not something you'd want to see while you're standing on the streets in a foreign country. The guides did arrive for Nancy and Mike and the other people that had booked this experience about an hour or an hour and a half late, but the first port of call was not one of the destinations that was planned. It was actually a petrol station. Back on the road again, Nancy and Mike and the other travelers were expecting to go and stop at a lookout point, which is one of Angola's most famous lookouts, and it's over this area that looks kind of like a barren moonscape. As the bus drove right past it and the travelers asked the guide why they weren't stopping, they were told that they had no time. Eventually they made their way to the gates of this safari place, wherever it was, and were told that we would just be going a little bit up the road to where the safari was to begin. 90 minutes of driving on very rough terrain, as documented by Nancy and Mike. They realized that they were now 3.5 or so hours away from the port with no sight of this place where the safari was scheduled to start. And this is where the travelers did the best thing that they could in the circumstances. Realizing how far away they were and the fact that they were in the middle of nowhere, they decided to band together to call an end to the tour. The all aboard time for Serenade of the Seas was 5 p.m, which was now 3.5 hours away at least. Had the tourists made their way to the safari, they essentially would have had to have turned around immediately anyway. So instead of taking the risk, the tourists banded together and demanded, in fact, that the tour end. We have seen this sort of issue occur time and time again. Those people were also on a private shore excursion and they did miss the ship on their way back. People need to be hyper aware that when you're on a private shore excursion, there is no guarantee of your return to port. A cruise line shore excursion, for as much as it costs, does guarantee your return to the ship, whether that's at your port or another port where the cruise line is responsible to get you to the next port of call, or even back to your home destination. Taking a chance and doing something privately can be a lot more exciting, and there are definitely advantages to doing so. But like I pointed out in my previous video on this topic, there are certain places where that's just not advisable. If you're unfamiliar with the country, the language, the technology, if you don't have access to a phone, to Uber, to taxis, to some sort of safety net where you think, well, even if I go off and explore on my own, I know that I can tap on my phone and be back at the port in half an hour or an hour, and I'm keeping a keen eye on the clock, so I can do that and I feel confident in doing that. There are certain countries on the planet where I just think for tourism purposes, especially if you're there on limited time, that it is just not smart to do these things by yourself. Taking a more cautionary approach to these sorts of decisions that you make during your trip and planning is the smart thing to do. I am a huge proponent for self-exploration during a cruise. I think for me, it's much more enjoyable and much more fun. We did a lot of that in Japan, like I mentioned, and you can actually watch that on my channel as well. But there are definitely places on the planet where I would feel more comfortable being within the confines of a cruise line shore excursion. To me, that would be an example of where it is worth paying the money. For Nancy and Mike, they had a great story to tell. I know that it was a harrowing experience for them. They definitely had some concerns while they were on the bus. They could see the ground through the bus floor. They realized later that the bus wheel, one of them was missing, or the bus entirely was missing 5 lug nuts. So there was definitely some safety concerns as well. Thank goodness they did make it back to the ship at about 3:45 p.m. after they were able to convince the tour guide to just head back. So it was a great ending for Nancy and Mike and the other travelers on this tour, but keep in mind that these things can happen. Incidents can happen along any tour and along any part of any trip, but I think just maintaining that sense of your own safety and security as being paramount is really, really important. If this tale serves no other reason than to give you an impression about when you should probably choose to stay with the cruise line shore excursion, then I think job well done. Nancy and Mike, thank you so much for sharing your story. I think it's super important for cruisers all over the world to hear that things can go wrong. And I'm so glad that it all worked out well for you guys, but definitely something to keep in mind. For everyone watching this, please let me know in the comments, have you ever had any near misses with arriving at the ship late from a day in port, or have you ever been on any questionable or iffy private shore excursions? Make sure you give Nancy and Mike a follow and check out all of their videos to see what it's like being on a 9-month world cruise. And if you're interested in booking any sort of cruise and supporting my channel and work, you can head to my website, thecruiseandtravelguide.com.au, and give me a follow on Facebook and Instagram at The Cruise and Travel Guide. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you soon. As most of you know, part of the fun of cruising is getting off the ship and exploring, and that makes, as part of, or hire a private tour guide or a private shore,